A world on fire. Ferocious wildfires up and down the West Coast.
In my 19 years in the fire service, I've seen a tremendous growth in wildfire.
Fires in Western Washington no longer the exception.
Can it happen here? Yes, it can happen here, and it does happen here.
The danger threatening our communities, our homes.
Well, my wife, I think our house is gone.
Fires more intense and harder to fight.
Apparently at one point they were deciding whether they should just let the neighborhood go.
Blistering hot temperatures and desperately dry conditions compounding the problem.
With climate change, we have more frequent drought, we have more intense drought.
What can we do?
The goal here is that fire, if it comes here, it's going to be managed much easier in getting that fire put out.
A fight that's far from over.
We are in a fight against time.
This is a King 5 News special report, Scorched Earth. Here's your host, Glenn Farley.
Thanks for joining us here on King 5. I'm Glenn Farley. I've been here in the Northwest for 35 years, and in that time, I've reported about wildfires and the science of wildfires extensively. The wildfire trends are unmistakable, both here in Washington and around the West. There are more of them, they are bigger, they are more and more devastating. Every year, there is more scorched earth. In our region, we're not only seeing neighborhoods destroyed by fire, but even entire small towns. During the next hour, I'm going to show you why things are getting worse and what's being done to try and make wildfires less dangerous, both to the survival of the forest and to ourselves. I'll talk with the experts, look at the role of climate change and how old forest management practices have contributed to where we are now, and how new forest management practices may lead us out. How the air you breathe is a toxic stew of pollutants, even when fires are far away. This fire season, King 5, along with several of our closest stations, have looked at this issue from many angles and have ways you can protect yourself. So where do we stand as the end of the 2021 fire season is in sight? As of early September, the state has logged 1,716 fires. That is a record. And fires have names, many of which you've been hearing about for weeks, if not months. And the numbers from the largest fires are impressive. Thousands of acres scorched, often leading to evacuations. And some fires are still burning. And again, at this count, more than 630,000 acres in Washington have burned. That, however, is not a record. Around 200,000 more acres burned in 2020. That's the state's second highest burn total on record. It's clear wildfires pose a major risk to the Northwest. Washington calls itself the Evergreen State. Of the state's 43 million acres, more than half is covered by trees. But environmentally, the Evergreen State is really two states. The wetter west side, dominated by Douglas fir, hemlock, and cedars, and the drier east side, the land of ponderosa pine. And while wildfire happens more often on the eastern half of the state, that has begun to shift. And history has shown both east and west have seen massive record-setting megafires. So the east side of the state, too much of the forest looks like this. A lot of low-hanging brush, small trees, all ladder fuels when caught on fire that could kill the bigger trees. We walk across the road here, you see what has already been treated. There's a lot more space, and actually land you can see.
Our crews come in here and remove the dead, dying, diseased trees, smaller diameter trees, get more space between trees, clean up the woody debris on the ground. And the goal here is that fire, if it comes here, that it's going to be managed much easier in getting that fire put out.
West of Yakima, near an area known as Atanum, is where I met up with Lands Commissioner Hillary Franz and State Forester George Geisler.
If without doing that, you're going to have fire that'll be in the crowns. And once it gets into that, at that point, suppression is just almost impossible.
The crowns, the tree's upper story that gets the most sunlight. Is it human intervention? Yes, but human involvement in the forest has been going on for thousands of years. Native Americans would burn off much of that low-level brush deliberately. But as the nation in the Northwest grew, the last century saw fires suppressed.
So remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
And while the message from Smokey Bear largely worked, the side effect was that all that low-level vegetation built up decade after decade. And when it does catch fire, the higher intensity is killing trees that had evolved with the tough bark to survive less severe fire.
This ponderosa pine was born in about 1620.
In 2018, U.S. Forest Service fire research ecologist Paul Hesberg showed me a cross-section of a tree that had survived fire after fire for the better part of 400 years.
1720, another fire, 1731, 1759, 1771, 1776.
He works at a special forest lab in Wenatchee. He keeps counting evidence of frequent fires embedded in the tree's rings.
Then 1939, and then there's a stretch of 60 years without fire, ending in 1999 when the tree died.
That means the trees that withstood frequent low-level fires for centuries could no longer survive the intensity of today's worst fires. Additionally, foresters say all that low-level growth weakens the bigger trees by competing for nutrients in the soil. So what do you do?
So Alpha 1 is going to be left flank, Alpha 2 is going to be the right flank.
You burn under controlled conditions. Low-intensity fires prescribed by trained experts, mostly in the spring. Not unlike the natural fires that old ponderosa survived for centuries.
And we set a goal of 1.25 million acres that we will treat over the next 20 years.
And that's just in eastern and central Washington. What's called mechanical removal, like what happened here, and that's expensive. The long-range goal is to turn that woody debris into marketable products, from stove pellets to sustainable aviation fuel to power our airliners, providing the money for more treatment. But getting there is taking time, making prescribed burning the primary option now.
Are you ever going to be able to catch up with that?
I mean, here's what I would say to you. We have a huge job in front of us just in central and eastern Washington. And we're also watching Western Washington struggling now in its forests. I could sit here and go, oh my gosh, this problem is way too big. There's not enough resources and not enough time to get on top of it, and say, too much, sorry, but I would be failing. We would be failing the people of Washington State. We would be failing the increase in catastrophic fires if we just said it's hopeless, we can't do anything.
But Franz, who was elected as a Democrat to her post as Commissioner of Public Lands, pushed a landmark piece of bipartisan legislation in Olympia this past session. Generally referred to as House Bill 1168, it sets aside $125 million every 2-year budget cycle for more resources to fight fires that we don't want and get our forest healthy again.
House Bill 1168's passed. How do we move at the pace of wildfire on our forest health treatment? We got to go faster.
But pressure is also building on the west side, where a ponderosa pine has evolved to survive fires in moderation. Doug fir and hemlock have not. Fires here tend to kill entire stands of trees, and again, humans are playing a role, many unwittingly, as more and more of us are building our homes in the forest.
What you're seeing is a lot more exposure of people into forests that are drying out, and forests that are in bad shape from a forest health standpoint. That combination is really what is increasing the fire threat on the western side of the state.
We are in a fight against time.
The state's approach to these fires is already being tested, and later in this program, I will take you to a place to see how well that worked. A healthy forest requires balance. Tilt that balance through climate change or disrupting the forest's natural fire cycle, and bugs and disease can take over. They are the armies that have long attacked the trees of Washington. They are part of the ecosystem. But as trees come under stress from drought and climate change, they become more vulnerable to attack. And when they're done eating their fill, the trees left behind stand as gray ghosts. Even infested trees that are still green are already fatally wounded. The marks left behind at Blewett Pass by the spruce budworm are still here. One threat to the forest gives way to another.
It was shocking to me, having not seen a tussock moth outbreak before, how many acres just instantly turned gray.
Larry Leach manages forests for the Department of Natural Resources in the southeastern quarter of the state. The effects are startling. These gray trees, 100 acres of Douglas fir in the midst of unaffected ponderosa pine. What happened fast.
Yeah, just over the course of the summer.
So this is what we call a pheromone trap.
Glenn Kohler is the state's entomologist, a bug specialist.
We put up these traps to collect the males, and then when the population in these traps increases, we use them to know there's an outbreak on the horizon.
He says the female moths don't fly, but once the eggs hatch, the caterpillars are so small, the wind does the rest.
So to get to new areas, these will blow on the wind, and sometimes you'll get them to come to ridge tops, and you can start a new outbreak.
If you look over here, there's a couple more.
On the west side of the state, a big enemy is fungus, what they call root rot, killing trees by cutting off their ability to absorb nutrients. They lose their tops and then topple over, unable to stand with their roots gone.
In western Washington, the root disease is just as impactful, if not more, as it is on the east side.
In 2015, aerial surveys found 338,000 acres of sick and dying trees. By 2019, that had nearly doubled to 658,000. But it can take time for the impacts of one year to show up in another. Take these aerial photos. This image was made in 2015, the record drought year. This forest looks healthy. By 2019, each of those yellow dots represents a lodgepole pine succumbing to mountain pine beetle.
If with climate change we have more frequent drought, we have more intense drought, and what I like to call hot drought. So it's not just a lack of water, you've also got these days that are record high temperatures. Like on the west side, you're getting 95-degree days. The number of those days through the summer being in the 10, 12, 15, that puts a lot of moisture stress on the leaves of the trees.
It's all about balance. This Douglas fir was left as habitat for wildlife. It also plays host to other plants. But too many dead trees become standing fuel for large wildfires, like they are at Blewett Pass.
Can it happen here? Yes, it can happen here, and it does happen here.
Vulnerability of destruction. Up next, the wildfire that erupted near Sumner and Bonney Lake, and why it serves as a vital reminder of the risks on this side of the state.
It jumped the highway and was sparking in the neighborhood, south of the neighborhood, at the bottom of the neighborhood.
The fires tend to be rare, but they tend to be large.
Hot weather, tinder dry brush, and a spark is all that's necessary for an inferno. But there's another ingredient that fuels massive fires also ahead.
The scramble is on to save the 4 latest victims of Washington wildfires. The fate of 4 bear cubs coming up.
It's come to this. Fighting wildfires requires resources, and a key resource is aircraft and their ability to use water and retardant to stop a fire. But here's a first. Just weeks ago, the Washington Department of Natural Resources turned part of the Olympia Airport into a firefighting tanker base, complete with that red retardant you see being dropped on fires in TV news video. The reason is trying to control the growing wildfire risk in western Washington. Had they had it in 2020, one of the places where that tanker could have easily found itself was battling a scary fire in Pierce County, which for many in and around the community of Bonney Lake was a close call. The green shoots of spring can't hide the burned trees and downed timber from an important wildfire near the end of last summer.
I think it's an eye-opener. It's Sumner grade showed us something that I think a lot of us maybe didn't think would happen. It opened our eyes, woke us up to that the west side of Washington is not immune to a large-scale wildfire.
But it sounds like it could have been worse.
It could have been. I think we easily could have if we had not had everything come together at the right time.
John Parkinson recently took over as the new fire chief for East Pierce Fire and Rescue. But he was on duty on that windy Labor Day weekend in 2020. The Sumner grade fire is named for the steep, long climb along Highway 410 heading toward the Cascade Mountains. That weekend for the state as a whole
yes,
was horrible.
Yes.
And then it came here.
Yep. Yep. And I think one of the most helpless feelings that I recall listening to the radio was our on-scene incident commander, after he had already requested a second alarm, which was early in the fire, within just a few minutes asking our dispatch center, if I ask for a third alarm, am I going to get any resources? And the quick answer back was there are no additional resources. So no additional resources in the county or neighboring counties. So basically, you're on your own until further notice.
The fire was sparking, it jumped the highway and was sparking in the neighborhood, south of the neighborhood, at the bottom of the neighborhood.
King 5 spoke with residents Tamara and Kyle Casera after the worst had passed.
Apparently at one point they were deciding whether they should just let the neighborhood go.
Because it was so bad, and they stayed, and
they
stayed for strangers and you know, pride of their community, and the heroism was insane.
It was that close.
The person who was running this division, I still recall him pointing to a house down the road here and this house saying, you know, these houses are undefensible, we're going to lose them. And within minutes, they started burning. We didn't have the resources. He pointed to a number of other houses and said, in these houses, we're not going to be able to protect also. Again, it was almost like a scene out of a movie, with just at just the right minute, a new engine would show up just as fire was creeping towards a house. Just as fire was creeping towards another house, a helicopter would fly over and you'd see them dump a bucket of water on top of a house. We had a ladder truck in one of the cul-de-sacs basically working like a yard sprinkler, spinning in circles, defending houses.
In the end, only 2 houses were lost. He says many others had fire damage. They got lucky. The Sumner grade fire has become a benchmark for the fire potential here on the west side of the state. One of the fire departments that helped out on Sumner grade was Ording Valley. And in May, on a high-altitude logging site still subject to snowfall, Ording Valley provided training for fire districts and fire departments in Pierce, King, and other counties.
Are you seeing more fires in your area of service than you did, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
Absolutely. Yeah, in my 19 years in the fire service, I've seen a tremendous growth in wildfire and interface type fire.
Jake Wegley helped put together this training program. It's not a straight line, but the trend is clear. In the decade since 2010, the number of fire starts and the number of acres burned in Washington has gone up. 2015 stands out as the worst, well over 1 million acres, as that year stands as a record drought. 2020, the second most acres lost. The 813,000 acres, more than 13 times the area burned in 2010. And in 2 of the last 3 years, the Department of Natural Resources says 40% of the fire starts have occurred on the west side of the state.
So the training we're getting today will end up with our red card, our wildland training. We're going to be learning how to dig line, clean up hot spots, and maybe put some water on the fire as well.
Trevor Painter is one of those firefighters now adding wildland skills.
You know, our fire season is starting.
Charlie Burns retired after fighting fire for DNR for 47 years. Now he's helping Ording Valley deal with a growing reality.
Can it happen here? Yes, it can happen here, and it does happen here.
For firefighters, wind is rarely a good thing. And one type of wind event, although uncommon on this side of the Cascades, has done much to fan the flames. For the Northwest, September 2020 was a month from hell. Yes, there was Sumner grade, but in western Oregon it was far worse. 1 million acres went up in a string of fires that would eventually reach the Portland metro area. Homes burned, people died, these just recent examples. The 1902 Yakult Burn in southwest Washington extended into Oregon and stood as Washington's largest wildfire for over a century. In 1933, the Tillamook Burn became a fast-moving nightmare. These fires all had a particular key ingredient in common. They were driven by hot, dry winds coming from the east.
The 2020 fires, especially the ones in western Oregon last year, were so consistent with everything we know about those historical fires. The 1902 Yakult Burn, the 1933 Tillamook Burn. The Tillamook burn burned 200,000 acres in a 24-hour period, driven by east wind, and the Yakult burn traveled 30 miles in 36 hours.
Dan Donato and Josh Halofsky are fire research scientists with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. They are part of a study of those east winds. The Washington-Oregon state line is a political boundary. The winds could care less.
The 2020 fires are consistent with historical fires, and it turns out they burned in locations that also burned in the 1900s and all the way back to the 1850s. So none of the events of 2020 are necessarily surprising from a historical perspective. With all that said, though, we also know that 2020 was anomalously dry.
Fires on the west side of the Cascades are just a different animal than the ones we're more accustomed to on the east side. In some ways, it's not even a climate change question because it's the things we're talking about were in the past, and that's just part of how this landscape works.
I first met these scientists in 2019 on the site of the 52,000-acre Norse Peak fire, being used in multiple ways to study the way west side fires work. That fire started on the east slope of the Cascades and was blown over into western Washington.
The big fires that shape the landscape here in western Washington are a little bit like earthquakes. This is just another one that may not be on people's radar as much here on the west side.
The fires tend to be rare, but they tend to be large. And so that's what, keeps some people, concerned.
Nick Bond is Washington State's climatologist who is also involved in the east wind study.
It's not necessarily that there's going to be more of these east winds, but when they come along, this is what the landscape is going to look like. And that, there's the potential, that much greater potential for extreme fires.
Even if the number of east wind events stays the same, there is more opportunity for those east winds to cause damage because there are simply more fires on the western Washington landscape. In many ways, this is a numbers game. The latest census finds there are close to 1 million more people living in Washington than a decade ago. Since humans caused most wildfires, we're also seeing a record number of fire starts in 2021, a third of them on the west side, just waiting for an east wind. Forests, like all living things, are born and eventually die. And when those destructive winds come, how quickly can the forest regenerate itself? We tagged along with the University of Washington, their students and scientists, to watch a forest as it's reborn and how fire has always played a role. We're heading into the burn with two scientists from the Department of Natural Resources and the University of Washington.
So you'll walk up kind of just through there.
Jenna Morris and Sophia Cruza show us how they measure wildfire fuel on the forest floor.
Measure that in centimeters.
The Norse Peak fire burned through here once, but this burned forest could burn again. Most of the trees are now dead, but still standing, and a lot of branches now litter the floor.
Going to the base of the litter, about 5.5 up there.
Morris is working on her doctorate degree in forestry, this study looking at multiple aspects of a forest fire's aftermath.
And also, since these are some of the highest biomass forests in the world, this gives us a sense of some of the carbon consequences of these west side fires.
One question, just how quickly does the forest regenerate?
This is a Douglas fir seedling that is 3 years old.
Brian Harvey is an assistant professor in the UW School of Environmental and Forest Sciences.
As the conditions for fire potentially become more and more frequent as the climate warms, we should expect that the potential for fire may also increase on the west side.
You're going to hug the right side of this tree here.
They are comparing plots on burned land against plots on unburned land close by.
Angle's great.
There was a fire here too on this lush forest more than 300 years ago. The west side suffers what's called stand replacement fires. Basically, all the trees are killed and will eventually topple over. At this point, the new forest cycle is well underway.
In a system that's characterized by really long fire return intervals, that might mean that instead of fires happening every 500 years, we might see fires every 250 years or 100 years in some of these areas into the future, right? It's a question that we're still exploring in a lot of our research.
They're victims of Washington's wildfires, wildlife injured by the fire, heat, and smoke.
They're so resilient and they're so tough, and they're in pain and they don't understand.
Up next, the effort to save these bear cubs and get them back into the wild. And after people survive a wildfire, there is a mental toll.
I still remember like it was yesterday. I was shaking, my daughter was crying.
A look at the battle long after firefighters douse the flames. We often associate wildfires with cost. Last year, the Department of Natural Resources spent $100 million to suppress fires. Then there's the cost to home and business owners. And the analysis of costs of the 2021 season is scheduled to begin this month. But some of the costs are harder to measure, including the toll on mental health. Survivors often deal with PTSD and feelings of unease after escaping a fire disaster. Recognizing the problem and getting help are essential.
I had to rush and get both kids in the car. And I still remember like it was yesterday. I was shaking. My daughter was crying, "Mommy, what's going on? What's going on?" And I was shaking. I just kept telling myself, "It's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay," as I was shaking.
The memory of the Alameda fire that tore through communities in southern Oregon almost a year ago is still fresh, and the impact on Anna Pantoja's family is immeasurable.
Emotionally, it's been really hard. Not only for myself, but for my daughter.
Her daughter Genesis is just 6, diagnosed with PTSD from the fire.
So she's in therapy now. I'm in therapy.
These days, Pantoja says her anxiety is easily triggered, especially with the stress of finding stable housing and trying to get help from FEMA. Other fire survivors, like Anna D'Amato, are also having a tough time.
When it gets smoky or the temperature gets a certain way and the winds start blowing the way it was that day, we sort of go back to that day and like, oh, is it going to happen again? Can it happen again?
D'Amato says mentally, she's just not the same.
I find it's still hard to focus sometimes, and there are things that I really can't remember before the fire.
The anxiety also extends to first responders in the area.
Before we would expect to run a call, but now we're not just expecting to run a call, we're almost expecting the worst every time. I'm a captain here at Fire District 5.
Aaron Bustard with Jackson County Fire District 5 remembers the Alameda fire moving quickly, fueled by dry vegetation and strong wind.
It was kind of overwhelming because we'd never seen anything like it.
On staff that day were just 9 firefighters.
I had asked, I was like, when are the resources getting here? And we were just told there's nothing coming. It felt pretty defeating.
The lack of resources due to multiple fires burning across Oregon.
It was frustrating, and very frustrating not being able to do something. We still look at areas of our community that residents haven't been able to come back to.
In the end, roughly 2,500 homes burned in the Alameda fire. Add to the constant reminders of what happened, the guilt many first responders feel.
We all felt so bad about what happened, and we felt almost like we failed.
But Bustard says mental health resources through the Firefighters Union helped a lot. And there are other resources. One of them, the Red Cross, which has licensed mental health professionals who volunteer their time responding to disasters across the U.S.
Stopping and taking some really deep breaths. You do 4 or 5 of those and you really can feel the anxiety and the stress sort of leaving your body. So that's one thing. Going for a walk, talking to friends.
Pantoja hasn't found a technique that works for her quite yet, but she finds comfort in being prepared.
We're ready. We have all the important documents and we know where they're at.
For now, she's still dealing with the mental and emotional fallout associated with the fire, and she knows it'll be a long road.
And it's gonna take more than a year to, I don't know, have our normal lives back.
Wildlife, animals are also victims of wildfires. As flames destroy habitats, we can only guess at the impacts, both direct and indirect. As King 5's Eric Wilkinson shows us, several black bear cubs rescued from eastern Washington are now being treated at an animal rescue shelter in Linwood.
To be honest, it's heartbreaking.
For as gruesome as their wounds are, these black bears are the lucky ones. 3 surviving cubs, 2 of them believed to be siblings, the new faces of Washington's wildfires.
They're so resilient and they're so tough, and they're in pain. You know, they're in pain and they don't understand.
Each suffered severe burns to their faces, ears, and paws. One of them so severely burned it wandered blind, its eyes swollen shut. Another was forced to crawl out of the forest on its elbows. The cubs are kept away from people as much as possible and monitored around the clock by video. Workers at the Progressive Animal Welfare Society say in their 34 years of treating bears, they've never seen any burned in a wildfire.
This one for me was very traumatic. I mean, you're seeing the devastation of the burns and the animal suffering.
The baby bears are all victims of this year's 25-mile and Cedar Creek fires near Chelan and Wenatchee. Washington wildfires have scorched more than 4 million acres over the past decade. Rescue workers say they're now seeing more wildfire-wounded animals brought in every year. State Lands Commissioner Hillary Franz says those who manage to escape face a difficult future.
Those landscapes have charred and burned to such an intensity, many of them, that it will take many years for that area to come back and become revitalized as a habitat.
If these 3 bears are released, they'll face a future with no mothers to guide them. But for now, they're growing stronger with the hope that once they are out of the woods, they'll be able to return and survive.
It's an emotional struggle for sure, I think, for the entire staff and everybody who works with these animals. But the reward is seeing them come through in the end.
One of the 4 bears originally brought here to pause did have to be euthanized. The other 3 will have to undergo 8 to 9 months of treatment before they can be released back into the wild. In Linwood, I'm Eric Wilkinson for Scorched Earth.
The cost people pay can come in ways we can't measure. Light a fire illegally, you can go to prison or be ordered to pay the staggering amount it costs to fight wildfires. We've long known that people are responsible for most wildfire starts. And we're not just talking about lit cigarettes being tossed out of windows or people who don't properly extinguish their campfires. One of the biggest causes of wildfires in Washington, debris burns that get out of control.
We see smoke or fire investigations, illegal burns, pretty frequently because folks, they're actually getting rid of some wood debris, their yard waste.
How often do you go out on a call like that and have to educate someone?
We're probably responding to 2 or 3 of those a week. And whether it's intentional or not, I think it's important that people just understand that there's a consequence to your action and that action could be jail time.
The 2017 Eagle Creek fire in the Columbia River Gorge that started in Oregon and spread into Washington burned an area larger than Washington, D.C. That fire started by a 15-year-old setting off fireworks. Sentenced to 5 years probation and nearly 2,000 hours of community service. In 2020, a California couple facing manslaughter and reckless burning charges after a gender reveal smoke bomb set off tall grass that grew into a blaze that killed a firefighter. So we have seen the increased risk of wildfires, why they happen, and the toll. But there is hope. Things you can do to protect your property and neighborhood.
At one point, people were like, what are you so worried about? And I thought, oh yeah, this is the story of Chicken Little.
Up next, the program that could make a major difference during a disaster. If you own a home and property, there are ways to make it safer from wildfire. Back in April, we visited Whidbey Island, which, like much of western Washington, is expected to only become more vulnerable. They are clearing out low-hanging branches, even entire trees. For wildland firefighters, this is fuel that any future fire won't have available to burn. Because the evidence is growing that more wildfire is coming to the wetter west side of the state.
There's definitely an increase in public awareness of the fire problem.
David Way is the wildfire program manager for Northwest Washington, which includes Whidbey Island.
And so if there were a fire in here, we'd need to use this road to get fire engines in and out.
The road making for better access between the Pondia Estates neighborhood and the adjacent Fort Eby State Park. Jeremy Cahill and Kelly Rozo clearing brush away from their new treehouse in the forest. Also turned into chips.
It did cross my mind, but I didn't
think that Whidbey had a significant problem with it, certainly not as much as Eastern Washington.
Because it's so green here, too.
Yeah.
So you're like, don't think about that.
Community members to state and local agencies all working together to create these fire-wise neighborhoods.
The nice thing about Firewise and wildfire preparedness in general is looking at trying to reduce the continuity of fuels, of vegetation.
Kelsey Mote is with the Whidbey Island Conservation District getting more communities on board.
I have a new community on the south end that would like to start the process as well.
Terry Jo Summer-Rieger heads this neighborhood committee.
There's been a learning curve in the neighborhood here, you know, because at one point people were like, what are you so worried about? And I thought, oh yeah, this is the story of Chicken Little, you know, but it gradually catches on.
Firewise is a nationwide program, and the idea here is to spread that message so more neighborhoods can take steps to protect themselves. Firewise is all about defensible space. Within 30 feet of a structure, limit the number of trees, keep them scattered. Also keep wood piles and other burnable materials away. Out beyond to 100 feet, keep vegetation watered and mowed. So if it does catch fire, any flames will be short and will slow down. Thin and prune trees. Of course, that's an ideal isolated home in a rural area. Most of us who live in neighborhoods will run into our neighbor's house well before we hit 30 feet. But where you can, move flammable materials away. That gives your home a better chance. That's not fog, it's wildfire smoke, a haze blanketing the northwest. The health risks all too real. Coming up, is this the new normal? And the technology that could alert you to potential trouble. You know the old saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, let's turn that around. Where there's fire, there's smoke. And the massive amounts of smoke from wildfires around the West travel long distances and expose many of us to the toxins and soot that those smoke clouds bring. Just a year ago, a 6,000-foot thick blanket of smoke from fires in Oregon and California was blown in and sat over western Washington. And the detection equipment operated by the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency showed just what we were breathing into our lungs. Now we're in another fire season, and people around the region are dealing with it again, though so far it hasn't been as bad in the Seattle-Tacoma metro area.
They are big, destructive.
It's all around us.
And as our climate continues to warm,
we're still trying to wake some people up, get them out of here.
They will get worse. We've watched as massive wildfires devour forests, towns, and neighborhoods, but their impact is felt much farther away. Because where there are flames, there's also smoke that can travel long distances. This season, we've watched smoke from fires burning along the West Coast.
Unfortunately, the haze is coming at the expense of some massive wildfires out west.
Blew across the country.
Yeah, it's a U.S.-wide problem. I mean, even if the fires are contained to the western U.S., we're seeing impacts across the continental U.S.
It's a phenomenon Portland State University Assistant Professor Elliot Gall has been studying.
So we've always known that, large-scale wildfire events can impact entire regions and, in fact, have global impact. But I think as we see hotter and drier summers, we're seeing larger fires.
And the larger the fire, the more its smoke will travel. Here's why. A large fire can actually generate its own weather and create conditions that allow the smoke to reach the upper levels of the atmosphere. Those upper levels are where you'll find the jet stream, strong and consistent winds that can push smoke over great distances, causing not only hazy conditions, but also serious health problems.
As I understand, New York City saw an air quality index of over 150 during those few weeks when they were, impacted by the fires in the West. And that's a level that's sort of of acute concern to the general population.
Gall and many scientists are tracking the movement of wood smoke through low-cost sensor networks like this one.
This sensor here is called a purple air sensor.
These sensors measure the levels of particulate matter in the smoke. You can see even in cities far from the wildfires.
Let's pan over and take a look at what's happening in Denver.
The levels are disturbingly high.
We're seeing air quality indexes of 140, 150. These are levels of outdoor particulate matter that the general population should be concerned about.
Which raises the question, if a warming climate will lead to more and larger wildfires, is there anything we can do to protect ourselves?
Experts say better forest management will be critical because once the fire starts, there is little that can be done to remove the pollutants from the atmosphere. What we can do, says Gall, is to at least remove them from our homes as much as possible.
Preparedness is really key.
Number 1, invest in a mechanical filter, a filter that filters out those wood smoke particles. Secondly, purchase an air cleaner, something Gall says we should all have regardless.
If you purchase an air cleaner and use it regularly, there is a robust body of evidence that shows it will improve your health over the long term if you use it regularly.
And lastly, create what's called a clean room in your home.
Basically, selecting a zone in your home and emphasizing and focusing your resources in a small zone of your home like a bedroom.
This is something even the EPA recommends we all do because scientists realize as our climate warms, large-scale fires will become more frequent.
And so, I don't think this is a Western U.S. problem. This is a global problem. This is a U.S.-wide problem. It's one we collectively need to work together and address.
It's the wildfire plan put to the test. Scientists use stands of trees to see how effective thinning the forest is. Will the lessons learned help shape policies well into the future? That's next. At the beginning of this program, I showed you the types of things the state is doing to lessen the destructive impact. That program is already being tested by one of this season's biggest fires. There are spots where the ground still smokes, in a forest with a story to tell. A forest that found itself on the front line of the huge Cedar Creek fire in Okanogan County just a few days before our visit. This is the biggest test so far of the state's forest health plan. Can you treat a forest so it has a better chance of surviving wildfire?
Oh, you can see what's out here, right?
Bottom line here, is this what you wanted to see?
Pretty much, yeah. I think most of this area that we're looking at that has had some fire impact is the low intensity underburn that we would really like to see on a unit after we've treated it like we did with the harvest.
I'm out with two firefighting veterans with decades in the business of forestry and the fight to protect it. The sound of firefighting helicopters testify that the Cedar Creek fire is far from contained.
If you had fewer trees, you're going to have better survival.
Pat Ryan oversees timber harvest on the state-owned trust lands that provide money for school construction.
It would look a lot different.
Ken McNamee is now the regional manager for the northeast quarter of the state. Low-intensity fires used to occur naturally and regularly, often triggered by lightning that hit this tree. That was the natural part of the cycle, the kind of stuff that you're trying to get back to.
Exactly. Pre-settlement structures is what we're looking for out here in our stands.
To recreate those conditions, in 2019, this stand, known as Unit 1, was thinned. Hundreds of trees taken out, along with much of the other low-level vegetation that, when lit, act like ladders, allowing the flames to climb to the tops of the trees, killing them. For the most part, that didn't happen here. To find out, Ken McNamee carves out an answer.
You can see how deep the bark is already.
Ponderosa pine bark evolved to survive fires like this.
Okay, we're starting to get into the cambium now. You can feel that this is still moist. Right there, that's the cambium layer, and that's the vascular system of the tree. So that's where the roots take the water up to the top. So right now, this is still kind of moist, so it tells me it didn't get super hot. Okay. So it's probably got a pretty good chance.
But another test called Unit 2 did not do so well. Still considered too dangerous to enter, we look from across the valley with Lands Commissioner Hillary Franz.
We are learning this as we go in part. There's a discrepancy in science about how many trees should be left on the landscape, and obviously not all landscapes are the same. In this case, we left in many places about roughly 40 trees per acre. We're going to be going in after this fire's put out, and we're going to use it to learn.
But while these trees may not survive, the energy released here through the flames may have been less intense, giving firefighters a better chance to save the homes of people who live here. Clearly, these are early days as the state of Washington tries to mitigate the impact of wildfires. We will stay with it as answers come in and as more initiatives are pushed out. Our summers, even our springs and falls, are only expected to be drier and warmer, if not hotter. There will be more drought years like this one, and it's up to each one of us to do the one thing that's in our control. Don't become an ignition source. Count on King 5 to bring you important information about wildfires, state policies, and land management. Thank you for joining us on Scorched Earth.